This week marks 4 years since Boris Johnson announced the UK's first national COVID lockdown. But the impact continues. A new campaign by charities and health professionals shows children born during the pandemic who missed early health checks as a result are facing a developmental time bomb. Nearly 1 in 5 children missed their 1-year health check in 2023, meaning that by the time they reach the age of 2, 1 in 5 toddlers are behind their expected developmental progress. The knock-on effect is that 24% of school starters were not yet toilet trained, and in the worst cases, children couldn't even make eye contact. Clearly, urgent action is needed, but what sort of action do we want? Well, joining us to discuss this, Director of Kindred Square, one of the charities involved in this research, Felicity Gillespie. Felicity, thank you very much for joining me on the programme. So explain what the effect has been on children's development of being born in COVID, so therefore not being examined and looked at and visited by health visitors and not starting nursery. What has that done to children's development?
I think the absence of social interaction, both for parents and for babies, of various ages between 0 and 4 has been to cause a bit of a developmental delay. But I think the bigger point really is that delay was evident before COVID. So COVID hasn't made it better. In fact, it's made it worse. But the problem was there before. And our argument is that if we don't change things dramatically now, things will go on being bad even after the effects of COVID are sort of out of the public eye.
So when you say, Felicity, the problem was there before, what was the problem and why was it there before?
The problem that we have now is the number of children who are starting school, starting reception, developmentally behind where they should be for their age, which means that children are starting behind before they even begin their education. And the reason that matters is because of the impact that being behind before you start school has throughout the rest of your life. We know, for instance, that your developmental progress at 22 months before you're even 2 is an accurate predictor of your educational attainment at 26 years. So where you are before you start school, your brain is growing so fast. The fastest development we see is in those first 2 years. So if you're behind at 2 and then at 5 when you start school, those effects are long-term, and for the children of COVID, obviously, that's going to carry on for years to come.
All right, so to make this clearer, so that we understand what we're talking about here, give me some of the milestones or some of the attainments that a child should have reached at the age of 22 months, so before this child is even 2, and then tell me the sorts of things that these children of COVID in particular have not achieved by the time they're 22 months. So where should they be and where are they?
Okay, so let's just look at what teachers and parents are telling us. So teachers are saying that the children that started school this year, that were 1 when COVID lockdown happened, 1 in 4 of them is not potty trained. About a third can't put their coat on, can't dress themselves independently, and they can't feed themselves independently. And a child starting school should be able to do both of those things. And more than that, there's the sort of social and emotional, the behavior, the ability to manage your own emotions, the ability to behave, to be able to sit down when you're told to on a mat, to follow a basic instructions, and indeed to make your needs known, to be able to say, I'm hungry, I'm scared, I've wet myself. If a child can't communicate those needs when they start school, that makes their life very, very difficult, and of course has a huge effect on the rest of the class and on the school itself.
All right. Well, let's be sort of factual and practical about this. Children in general don't potty train themselves. Potty training is an episode that's normally dreaded by parents and resented by children. And it's one of these things you've just got to get through. No one enjoys it. It's really hard work. I remember it felt like almost a year running around with a potty, behind a child that was uncooperative and uninterested and all of that. But you have to put yourself through it and your child through it. A little bit like teaching them to ride a bike, which comes a bit later, to tie a bow and all the things that you have to teach a child to do. Potty training is about the parents, and the parents being persistent and the parents being diligent until the child gets the message and gets the hang of it. So if you say that children are arriving in profusion at school at the age of 5 to start reception, not potty trained, this isn't anything to do with COVID. This is just parents who haven't stepped up to the plate, isn't it?
I think there's definitely an issue about parenting. I think it's hard to talk about parents as a group, because if you're talking about 1 in 4 children not being toilet trained, and indeed the other thing we found was that half of parents didn't think it was solely their responsibility to do the toilet training. So if you've got that number of parents, it's hard to sort of make blanket statements about parents in general. I think what's more important is that as a society, we need to be talking about parenting. You know, what kind of parenting do we think we should all be engaged with? What do we think about the importance of the early years? If we're saying that, 60% of the gap at GCSE is evident at 5, why are we only starting, if you like, key stage 1 when children are 5 at school? Why aren't we recognizing that all babies are learners from birth? Their brains are growing at the fastest rate right from birth. We should be focusing on those earliest years to ensure that every child has the opportunity to start sort of a level playing field.
But I feel as if I've had this conversation, Felicity, with the late wonderful Tessa Jowell about 20 years ago. She's now passed away, but she was an absolute advocate of early years and facilities for little children, and particularly for parents who didn't have access to toys and books and that kind of a thing. And this is not a new concept, this idea that early years begins pretty much with birth. You've got to teach children, you've got to talk to children, you've got to sing to them, you've got to read to them, you've got to give them water play and sand play and all those sorts of things. And people who don't naturally know how to do it or haven't got the facilities to do it need to be helped and shown how to do it so that the children have an advantage, not a disadvantage. This has been going on for decades. So what's happening here? I feel as if you and I have just walked into some episode of Call the Midwife set in 1953. I don't understand how we can be having this conversation in 2024. How can we be?
Vanessa, welcome to my world. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Why are we still having this conversation? Because as a society, we are still allowing it to happen. We're voting for governments that persistently underfund the early years in proportion to the rest of education. As a nation, we are not focusing our resources, our attention, our time, our money on these early years. We're still assessing the quality of education on the basis of what happens in exams at 11 and at 16, when actually the fact that, we have so many children, half of the teachers in this year's survey, half the teachers say it's worse this year than last year. And even though the numbers who are blaming COVID, who say that COVID's had an impact, that the numbers of teachers saying it's COVID have gone down year after year in the last 3 years. But they're saying the problem of school readiness, the problem of children not being developmentally ready is getting worse. So, I mean, you're asking the question on the radio and on the television. That's brilliant. That's, you're asking the question. But how much of this is really discussed, is really out in the open? Because again, the survey shows that ignorance is a massive problem. Half the parents we talked about, 45% of parents surveyed don't know that the early years are when the greatest impact on later life happens, that the greatest brain development is happening in the early years. Half of parents don't think it's their responsibility to do these things.
Okay, one last question. How much of an impact, I know you can't answer this in an actual quantity, but how much of an impact do you suspect that the fascination and mesmerizing effect of the smartphone, at which everybody is staring almost 24 hours a day, has had on this when it comes to making eye contact with your child, talking to, singing to, playing with, interacting with your child? If everybody we know is staring at our phones, and this includes us, mine is right here. I shunned it for years. Only in the pandemic did I get hold of this. I used to have an £8 Nokia. There was nothing to see. I used to think, look out the window, have conversations. Not anymore. I stare at my phone just like everybody else. How much of an impact on all of this do you think the smartphone is having?
I think, of course, it's having an impact. I mean, we're all guilty of it, aren't we? The teachers said that 28% of children, 28%, 1 in 3, were unable to use a book when they started school in September. And by that, I mean, when they're given a picture book, they didn't turn the pages. They swiped it like a tablet. So that's an indication, isn't it, that but one can't point the finger and blame, because look, as you say, we're all guilty. We've all, but it's a conversation that we need to be having. Is it okay? No, of course it's not okay. So, what are we going to do about it?
I don't know what to say. I feel like I need someone to sign me up as the interact with your baby czar, and to go around the country and kind of show how you do it, because obviously
Vanessa,
it isn't.
consider
It's not
yourself
coming
signed.
naturally, is it? It can't be coming naturally.
No.
People can't be
No.
doing it. Okay,
No.
thank you so much. This is really distressing conversation, Felicity. Thank you very much for having it with me.